If politicians, scientists, and the media are correct, climate change is an existential threat necessitating drastic and expensive measures to prevent our children and grandchildren inheriting a miserable world of famine, pestilence, war, and anarchy. But there is another explanation, that climate change is actually a fake crisis being used by cartoon-like villains whose goal is to seize power and transfer wealth from poor people to themselves. Intelligent people instinctively know which of these analyses is correct. These are the people whose instincts were right about COVID being relatively harmless, the mRNA vaccines being unsafe and ineffective, and transgender people having a mental illness. If I'm not mistaken, they will soon also be vindicated on the theory that Hillary Clinton not only ordered the hit on Jeffrey Epstein, but did it herself with her own cold hands. But for those whose instincts are less resolute, let's compare the relative merits of each analysis, each of these two analyses. The first recorded example of climate catastrophism is from Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, when the Epic of Gilgamesh told of the gods being displeased with humans and wiping all but a handful of them out in a flood. You might recall reading a similar story about Noah in the Bible's Old Testament, and another about an even more cataclysmic end of the world in the New Testament's Book of Revelation. These stories of divine retribution have survived because their standard moral framework appeals immediately to anybody with a conscience who is grappling with the mystery of free will in an imperfect world, which is most of us. But these days are different. In this post-religious world, there is no divinity to impart divine retribution. So, who imparts it and how? Enter Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Climate change is an existential threat. We all recognize that. There's increasing urgency around that. But the converse of that, the flip side of that is if you're taking steps, making investments, coming up with new technologies, changing the way you do business, all in service of reducing and eliminating that threat, you're creating value. And what we have seen increasingly, spurred initially by the Sustainable Development Goals, accelerated with Paris, and then through social movements and others and governments acting, is society is putting tremendous value on achieving net zero. So the companies and those who invest in them and lend to them, who are part of the solution, will be rewarded. But those who are lagging behind and are still part of the problem will be punished.
You'll be punished, huh? Whoa. Well, Carney's not alone, of course. In 2023, the UK passed the Energy Bill, for example, which granted the government powers to fine property owners up to £15,000 or imprison them for up to 1 year for failing to meet net zero energy targets. And you can detect this divine power, some might say it's arrogance, in the demeanour of politicians like Australian Energy Minister Chris Bowen and the new Environment Minister Murray Watt, who are both resolute about their moral obligations and ruthless with anybody who dares to get in their way. As long as they're not Chinese, that is. Bowen and Watt are members of a government that would have gone bankrupt years ago if it hadn't creamed off billions of dollars in export revenue from coal shipped to China. But even this fits, however clunkily, into their moral worldview. To them, coal only changes the weather if white people burn it. That's why we Australians must resort to solar panels and windmills while China can fire up as much coal as it likes. And it does, going through 4.7 billion tonnes of the stuff every year. None of that has any effect on the climate, according to the Australian government. Well, at least no effect worth raising at bilateral meetings anyway. But defend the use of coal to keep Australians warm in winter or cool in summer, and watch people like Bowen and Watt respond like Jesus expelling merchants from a temple. Which brings me to the other theory, that the proponents of climate change and net zero are using a wholly manufactured fear to seize power and line their own pockets. Well, the evidence speaks for itself. The net zero zealots are in power and they are enriching themselves handsomely, and yet not one of their predictions of Armageddon has yet come even close to being true. Our children and grandchildren won't be thanking us for saving the planet, because we're not. But they will think we were hopeless wimps for sitting back and letting these climate zealots destroy our prosperity instead.